Thy mercy, my God, is the theme of my song, the joy of my heart and the boast of my tongue. Thy free grace alone, from the first to the last, has won my affections and bound my soul fast. Without thy sweet mercy, I could not live here. Sin would reduce me to utter despair. But through thy free goodness, my spirit's revived. And he that first made me still keeps me alive. Thy mercy is more than a match for my heart, which wonders to feel its own hardness depart. Disowned by thy goodness, I fall to the ground and weep for the praise of the mercy I found. And the covenant love of thy crucified Son. All praise to the Spirit, whose whisper divine seals mercy and pardon and righteousness mine. All praise to the Spirit, whose whisper divine seals mercy and pardon and righteousness mine.
Hi, I'm John J. Thompson, the Associate Dean of the School of Music and Worship Arts here at Trevecca, and welcoming you to part 2 of our Newell Hymnody lecture, also affiliated with our Music City Colloquies series, with our special guest, Twit, who is the head of the Reformed University Fellowship at Belmont University, and singer-songwriter and worship leader Sandra McCracken, talking about hymns and their power for us to understand worship and put them into practice. If you haven't seen part 1, definitely go back and watch that. Sandra, that was an awesome song. Tell us about that song. What did we just hear?
This is a song called Thy Mercy, and as we are talking about just this idea of hymns, this is one that was one of the first tunes that I put to an old text, and it was from Gatsby's hymnal, which we talked about in the first part of this episode. But yeah, Kevin gave me this hymnal, and I remember sitting and kind of poring over it, sitting with my guitar and trying to just sing. Well, the words already felt like they belonged to me, which I think that is the personal invitation that these hymns offer. It's like they're an invitation into community that goes back so much further than we could have imagined and goes forward so much further than we could imagine. So they bring us into the story that God is meeting his people, that he has met us, and that he will continue to meet us. And so just this theme, this hinge point that mercy holds us. And I love the confessional nature of this hymn as well. I've been singing this hymn in different places for a long time now. And just like, it's so good for me. Every time I get to those lines, like, without thy sweet mercy, I could not live here. Like, there is such a melting that happens when you have lines like this. And so anyway, it's been a very dear song for me that has carried me.
I think one of the things about that hymn and all the hymns, and you mentioned the confessional nature, you know, if ever I'm talking about hymns, I always want to make this point, that worship is formative, like it or not. right? The hymns that we sing or the songs we sing are expressing the DNA of our church. Like if you're singing songs like this, people, are picking up on mercy is a big deal. and we think it's a big deal here, right? If we're singing songs where there's room for lament, people feel invited in rather than feeling like they have to pretend everything's fine. So I just long for a day when pastors, church leaders, worship leaders will all come together and realize worship is formative and that we should attend to the kinds of songs we're singing because it's about discipleship. And this is a great one. She said, like, you could preach a sermon, 4-point sermon on these 4 verses. And what's remarkable is we don't know hardly anything about the guy that wrote this text. Yeah. John Stocker, he put 3 hymns showed up in a magazine in the 1700s, and we don't really know much about him at all. And they're remarkable. Like, this is an incredible text.
Wow. You say you could preach a sermon on these 3 verses. Isn't that kind of also one of the effects that some hymns had? Like, you say we become what we worship, but hymns also are instructional as well, aren't they? I mean, they kind of delivered our theology.
I get to quote John Wesley at Trevecca, right? We look back to Wesley, right? So John Wesley famously said that the hymn book is a little body of practical divinity. In other words, it is about teaching and getting this stuff into our hearts. And when the African Methodist Episcopal Church started, right, which it's not a very good story, right? The white, Methodists decided one day that the black people have to go sit up in the balcony, and they were like, what? This was in Philadelphia, of all places. They marched down the street, and the first thing that Bishop Richard Allen did was published a hymnal of the new AME denomination. And the reason he said was because the Methodists aren't quite as Methodist as they used to be. They'd kind of lost a sense of who they are. And as a good Methodist, he said the first thing we need to do is get back to singing the kinds of songs that shape us and mold us. So, yeah, for sure.
So, as a songwriter, can you talk about the process of composing original hymn texts when you migrated from taking old texts and setting them to melodies to actually composing your own texts? And how did that happen, and how do you still approach that?
Well, songwriting, even at its best, is always mimicking, borrowing, translating something that's already there. So I think while that for me could be like an old folk tune from the 60s, or it could also be something from a hymnal. And I think I've just spent some time, on one hand, it sort of happened because the hymns were already devotional for me. So I began setting new melodies to things that I was drawn to on the page, just the written text. And then on the other hand, I've tried to be more intentional to learn how to do that, and then started writing hymns that were borrowing the idea, the shape, the cadence, the meter of the old texts, and trying to put that in my own language. And that's really been, I think, the one place where I see there's like tension or growth or both, is where the hymns can tend to be kind of heady. And then I think my natural bend as a songwriter is to move more and more simple, like moving toward, and I've joked about this before, but like singing, at a Tom Petty, album blaring on the radio, like that to me is unifying. And there's something in that where if we can say something plain and say something in a way that's really simple, I think it could both be theologically rich and accessible for us to sing it, which maybe goes back to that idea of just trying to keep this folk tradition alive.
Yeah. I have a couple tips I give people practically. And this isn't how I started, but I've kind of evolved to this method, seems to work better for me, is speak the words out loud to the text. Find the cadence, find the right kind of tempo that seems to make sense, and then try to, without an instrument in your hand, turn that speaking into a melody. That's definitely how I did Dear Refuge, My Weary Soul, and it's got a 2/4 bar in it that wouldn't have happened if I started with a guitar strum. And I can pretty much tell if somebody starts out with guitar chords that they like, because with hymns, they are so wordy, it feels like you're jamming the words in. But if you start with the way you would just speak it as poetry, it tends to work. And you have to remember, most people are never going to play it. They're going to sing it in a congregation. I think I've also benefited from the fact that I'm not a good singer, unlike Sandra. So I'm not going to write melodies that ordinary people can't sing. You know, the Rock of Ages ended up being kind of challenging.
Yeah, you've got some good melodies.
Yeah, I don't know. You know, I couldn't sing it. You know, yeah. So that's my general advice is to people. But I also like one of the things I loved in giving these old hymnals to people like Sandra was I knew that you had to really enter into that text to put a melody to it, and that was going to be good whether the song was good or not. That was still spiritually beneficial, and she was already doing that devotionally. But this became like a part of people's devotions, and again, that's an old tradition for hymnals that is fun to see that kind of coming back.
I would think it's okay to push the audience a little bit. If our culture has lost its ability to sing certain things, artists, when you become a fan of an artist, that might be one thing an artist can do, is actually inspire people to stretch a little bit and sing, get out of those boxes a little bit. Because it's true that 100 years ago, 150 years ago, 200 years ago, even the poor folks probably had a little bit more of a sophisticated cultural palette in some ways than some people do today, I think. And
yeah.
You know
well,
I think,
one of the things I've noticed about Sandra's tunes to hymns is there's always like a little surprise musically. Yeah. And I don't know if you intentionally do this. Matthew Smith and I have talked about this. There's like that melody that's your first impulse, and then there's pressing through that to find something that kind of is striking. And I think you've done that. I think about Laden with Guilt. I think about that one is like a half diminished chord in Thy Mercy, where it's just like, oh, and it kind of draws you in, and you have a great gift in doing that at the point where the lyrics do that. Because a lot of times within that verse, it's an AABA form, and often in that B, like you take it to a place that people didn't see coming, and yet once they're there, it feels like that's where it needed to go. That's intuitive, right? But then you analyze it afterwards sometimes. You're like, oh, that's kind of cool how that worked.
Right. Yeah, it's easier to talk about those things after the fact when in the moment you don't realize that it's happening. And I had that a number of times where there is like a split bar or there's something irregular, but when you're just singing it, you don't. I think it's great advice to sing without an instrument, to write melodies without an instrument, and then figure it out, map it out later.
Yeah. Also, I wonder, it seems, and I could be wrong about this, but it seems that a lot of the hymns that survive, or at least the ones that I've read about, most of them seem to have been written for a local community or a local church or maybe a couple of churches, maybe a denomination or something like that. But when you're thinking about, I'm going to write a hymn that's going to hit millions of people, that might also be that might set you up on the wrong path because you're now having competing agendas in your head and heart between success and platform and the function that the hymn is designed to do, where thinking of your immediate congregation that you're there to serve and writing a hymn for the people right in front of you might be the more beneficial thing to do. And I wonder if you could develop, if a songwriter, a worship leader could develop the ability to compose a hymn just for their own congregation, maybe even putting names of specific people in it that have been healed, or people in their church that are sick, or people that kind of thing could be pretty beautiful, because it would take the temptation of scale out and bring it back to that devotional communal level of we're all just going to sing this. I visited a church in East Tennessee, and it was part of that shape note singing community.
Oh, I love that stuff.
Old building where the pews are all facing each other. I didn't know what it was. I just took some pictures. It looked really interesting. I posted it online.
You haven't been to a Sacred Harp singing?
No.
Oh, dude,
but
I got to bring you.
Made a film about it.
Yeah.
Saw my picture and said, I made a movie in that building, and he told me all about why they were facing each other.
Yeah.
And it reminded me when we're talking about worship music or hymns that maybe part of this is about thinking about that community that's right in front of us and serving them with hymns as opposed to thinking about the masses.
Yeah. Listen, Martin Luther's first hymn he wrote was when he got news of the first 2 Lutheran martyrs, 2 teenage boys that were martyred, burned at the stake in Brussels. We don't sing it anymore because it does mention both of them by name. And so, maybe it needs to come back. I don't know. But Charles Wesley was famous for doing that. He would hear about a little Methodist group that got beat up by a mob, and he'd dash off a hymn and send it to them. And some of those, so that did happen. When it shifts is late 19th century with Fanny Crosby, when hymn, gospel music, unfortunately Chicago has a lot to do with, take some blame for this, and New York City.
And the printing press.
Yeah, well, the printing press was a long time, but it really became big business. And Fanny she'd basically sit in a room and just, write texts, and then they had a stable of tune writers, and it really became a little more formulaic. Now, she still wrote some great stuff in the midst of that, but that commercialism really came in late 19th century. It was kind of an American invention.
Which is the same as Scott Joplin. It's the same as sheet music. It's the same thing that's happening with music in general. That's my point, is that scale is not it's not a neutral thing.
Yeah.
So
but that's the challenge, right? Is to write a song that is like in a particular voice. You see this in the Psalms, right? There's lots of I's in the Psalms. They're not all we, but they're I in a sense that other people can enter into the story. Like when she sings "Dear Refuge in My Weary Soul," she's like trying on a text written by a lady 300 years ago and finding that God is still the same, yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and the kingdom of God just gets so much bigger, right? But and that's I think that's hard to do, to write in that I that can be a corporate, other people invited in. Now I don't write real songs, from original text like you do, but I feel like that's a challenge, right, for folk songs. I mean, that's part of the folk song tradition.
Yeah. And maybe it has more to do with who we are as human beings than what we're doing as a songwriter or in practice, because I think about, like, the more particular we are connected to one another, that, then if you're a songwriter, then it's going to come out in your songwriting, or if whatever your vocation is. I had a funny thing happen recently. When I wrote a song that's a folk song called Age After Age years ago. I wrote it after 9/11, but it has all these like fragments of story in it. There's a story in the first verse about 2 boys that had been in a flood, and one of them survived by standing on the shoulders of the other boy. And I heard this story when I was a kid, and I remember sitting in a car on the way from somewhere to another place, I don't even know, and I was writing this song, and that memory came back in 9/11, just thinking about what it is to stand on the shoulders of those who've gone before us. So fast forward to a couple of weeks ago, I had an email correspondence with somebody who was asking me about this story. Is this a true story? And I was like, I did some digging, I wasn't sure, and I just sent him an email saying, I'm sorry, I don't know how to verify it. He came back with 11 articles from the St. Louis newspaper from where I was 8 years old. And this was a real story. The little boy who died was Timothy. There were 2 boys. I mean, just unbelievable to read. And some of the lines that I had written in this folk song were verbatim from these articles. So somewhere as a child, that was part of my constitution, right? So as we live stories, and I don't know if I heard it or...
I heard Brian Chappell tell that story, and I'll bet you heard it.
It's like
he was
it was
the
in
president
our
of Covenant
community.
Seminary and a pastor.
That's so funny. So, and it came up again because my pastor now, Chad, referenced it, and he had heard it. Anyway, it's just, this is like, if this is who we are, then it will come out in these natural ways. And I think you're right to say, maybe we should name that and say, let's bring out the very particular stories and name the people, and so
I have this theory that songwriters and artists, they don't just say things differently, they see things differently. There's an attentiveness, to what's going on, and ability to name it that people resonate with it. I love that word, resonate, because that speaks to the communal thing where we can enter in. It's awesome.
And I feel like I'm kind of triangulating here on something, and it's getting closer and closer. This idea that if hymns are designed, like we talked about in the first part, to be singable by people who aren't musical, and poetry for people that aren't highly literate, at least literate in a poetic sense. So they're not entertainment in that regard. They're not a product in that regard. They're participatory. Then part of us probably has to become mindful of the difference between a product-driven song and a participatory-driven song. If they're theologically driven, then we got to become discerning about the theology that is there, because there is a theology. There's no neutrality, like you're saying. The theology is either good or bad, but there's going to be something embedded in that. We're meditating on something. Is it good, true, and beautiful? Is it myself, my feelings?
Well, it's a mix, right? I mean, I think about culture as being a map of reality that corresponds at some points and may not at other points. I think that's a helpful thing. But I do think, tending to what we're forming into people is really important. John Whitley, I know Sandra knows John up at Calvin Institute of Worship up there. He talks about how regular weekly worship forms us for our encounter with death. And I said one time, I was at some GMA panel once, probably the only time I was ever invited, and I wasn't invited back. But somebody was asking, what do you look for in a song that people pitch you, right? Because I produced these records, they thought that people pitch me songs. And I said, and everybody gave their answers, and they were all good answers. They're probably, when you were a publisher, they were probably the kind of things that you would have to look for, right? And I said, honestly, all that stuff's fine, but I'm looking for songs that form my students for their encounter with death, quoting John. And it was just like it's just a very different way to think about it, And popular isn't bad, right? It may mean that it's resonated with a lot of people. I really despise that idea that if it's popular art, it's automatically inferior. That kind of that's not fair. It's not true. I do think that the goal of it can be real different. And then it's not just the writer, there's also the people that, are the gatekeepers. Like there's so many levels where it's difficult. That's why one of the things I've tried to do is, okay, if I found an Ann Steele hymn that I like, and there's 20 of her hymns in here, well, she wrote almost 300, let me go find her collected works and find maybe there were great hymns that didn't even pass the gatekeepers in her day, and yet we might need to hear them, So that's kind of how I got into teaching hymnology, is trying to find out kind of more and more about that kind of stuff.
I would say a majority of churches that I encounter primarily function in the more modern worship, contemporary worship space. And so have you encountered any ways that some aspects of hymns, elements of thinking in a hymn-like way or worshiping in a hymn-like way, that we might be able to pull some of that into a contemporary setting so that it could have an influence on how we're doing worship in that space?
Yeah, sure. I think they're good. I think God's fingerprints are all over the place in these different aspects of culture. So while I have a great appreciation and a high view of hymns, I also really love to break the rules about what it means to add a chorus. And I think you've referred to that too. We've, even in Indelible Grace, we've said, here is what, the tradition is, here's how we honor it and learn about it, and let's go make something. And so whether that's coming from more of, I'm really interested in like the contemplative kind of styles of worship, like Taizé music, where you have very unifying themes, and they are done with such repetition that it creates, like in practice, these songs could be sung 30, 40 times, right? To where you're past where you're thinking about this song being sung this many times, and now you're thinking about what's beneath the song and what's beneath that, and you finally get to a place of quiet. So if a song can do that, that just brings a challenge to the critique of the praise chorus, right? Can we do this where it actually cultivates contemplative prayer in the middle of it? And that's not a thing that only belongs to one tradition, but that it's something we can share and reimagine. So we can build that out of the gravity of like, okay, we want to have something that's theologically sound, but we also want to slow ourselves down with how we sing it. Does that make sense? So kind of pulling in these different traditions, but I love seeing those things blend together.
I think, queuing off of that, one of the things I've learned from Ann Steele Like almost all of her hymns are direct addressed to God. And like a lot of people think hymns are talking about God and praise choruses are speaking to God. Like that doesn't work at all when you actually look at the corpus of songs in both cases. But I think that one of the things she does is in some way, like she uses direct address of God, often like they're not necessarily biblical, but in other words, they're not quotes, but they're creative. So, dear refuge of my weary soul, like that's enough. Like you can meditate on that and pray. And then almighty maker of my frame, or thou lovely source of true delight. Like she does it all the time. And I think you can actually learn how to pray. A.W. Tozer said once, next to the Bible, the best devotional book is a good hymnal. And it took me, 20 years to realize that I think he's onto something there.
Last question for this. Just directly address a student who is a worship art student or a songwriting student, maybe wants to be a worship leader. What advice do you have to somebody just in general getting off on this path that will encourage them towards richness and diversity, and how might hymns factor into their life in that way?
Well, I would just say my experience is that the Spirit has brought me both to a quiet place and to community. So those two things, like being able to listen and to hear him speak through the hymns and through the quiet and through the space between the notes and the hymns, and also just to do that together, that there is also something shared inherently, and we are made for this deep connection with one another. And so when we're singing together, or if you're practicing writing hymns and you're practicing studying hymns, or even just having almost like a book group, where you just bring hymns to share and talk about it, that would have, I think that could bear a lot of fruit. And it would be something that requires nothing, no prerequisites. Just come in and enjoy it together.
Same question to you, Kim.
Queuing off that thing I said about formative worship, I would say consider this, that worship is not just emotive, it's formative. And if that's true, how does that kind of reframe the way you're thinking about it? And also queuing off what she said about community, remember the church is bigger than people that talk like you and sing like you. And so try to hear voices, whether it's cross-culturally or going back in time, because there may be things that you kind of have filtered out about who God is and what he's done that maybe somebody else has heard. I really think it takes a whole community to really understand who God is and what he's done. And it connects to our stories. And why be limited to understanding God just through your own story? Don't neglect that. That's important. But don't limit yourself to that.
Man, thank you guys for being here. And you got another song that you'll share with us now to send us out? What's this last song you're going to do?
Yeah, I love this. This is one that I think is a great example of how Sandra writes in a hymn style, but it's an original text, but very hymnic. Yeah, it's our only collaboration.
And this one, yes, Kevin did the music and I did the text. I mean, you actually spoke into that a little bit too, but
tweaked it. Yeah,
tweaked a little bit.
The text here, straighten out the meter a little. Yeah, but it's beautiful text. I love it. We sing it all the time in our youth.
All right. Well, let's hear it.
Rock of ages, when the day seems long, from this labor and this heartache I have come. The skies will wear, but you remain the same. Rock of ages, I praise your name. Rock of ages, you have brought me near. You have poured out your lifeblood, your love and your tears, to make this stone come alive again. Rock of ages, forgive my sin. Rock of ages, Rock of ages, bind your children until the kingdom comes. Rock of ages, your will be done. Rock of ages, when in want or rest, my desperate need for such a Savior I confess. Pull these idols out from my heart embrace. Rock of ages, I need your grace. Rock of ages, Rock of ages, bind your children until the kingdom comes. Rock of ages, your will be done. Rock of ages, my great hope secure. Your promise holds just like an anchor to my soul. Bind your children with cords of love and grace. Rock of ages, we give you praise. Rock of ages, Rock of ages, bind your children until the kingdom comes. Rock of ages, your will be done. Bind your children until the kingdom comes. Rock of ages.